now I'm going to talk a bit about some of these organs, some of these glands that only serve the endocrine system and aren't serving another function. We're going to concentrate on those for the remainder of this endocrine system, and then go ahead and the rest of them are still important, but we're going to be talking more about those as they interface with other physiological systems. So we're going to come back to those, but right now I need to take the time to really concentrate in on these ones. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the pituitary gland that really is, in a lot of ways, very intimately connected to the hypothalamus, so I'm going to talk to them together. The pituitary gland here is a lobe essentially off the brain here, sitting right here. Then the hypothalamus is actually this area that's sitting kind of right on top of that, right up here. So they're kind of sitting pretty intimately together right there. So let's talk a little bit about the general anatomy of the pituitary gland. And one thing just to know, because this will come up, is it's also called the hypophysis. So kind of sound like you're trying to say hypothesis with a slur. So it's also called the hypophysis, and it's going to be connected to the hypothalamus by this branch, this small limb called the infundibulum. Now, the hypothalamus is going to control most of the pituitary release of hormones, so the hypothalamus is really in control of much of what the pituitary is doing. And the pituitary gland is really broken up into two separate portions that are really both anatomically and functionally very different. The first one is what's known as the anterior pituitary, which is also known as the adenohypophysis, which is connected to the hypothalamus vascularly. So it actually has blood vessels that are going between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary that serves kind of as a communication route between those two. Also, there's the posterior pituitary, which is also known as the neurohypophysis. And this is connected to the hypothalamus neurally. So there's actually neurons that are traveling between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Let's give you a little, another little glance at how this is happening. So as you look at this, again, this blue in here is the hypothalamus in this area. It's connected to the pituitary by the infundibulum, this area here in orange, and then down below we have the two branches of the pituitary, the anterior and the posterior. So that's that. So let's talk about each of these lobes in succession here. So first let's talk about the posterior pituitary. And together with the hypothalamus, this really forms a particular neuroendocrine system. This is one specific neuroendocrine system where we have the nervous system and the endocrine system that are married in very, very intimate contact. And the reason this is because we have axons from the hypothalamus that are going to terminate on capillaries inside the posterior pituitary. So we have these neurons that their cell bodies are in the hypothalamus. These axons are extending down to the posterior pituitary, and their axons are terminating on these capillaries where they're going to dump their neurohormones into this capillary. So really, the posterior pituitary is really just an extension of the hypothalamus. It's essentially this lobe of this hypothalamus that's extending down to the pituitary gland so it can dump some of its neurohormones into the blood supply there. In particular, the hormones that this is going to be doing secreting is vasopressin and oxytocin. They're going to be stored independently in these secretory granules, which are essentially secretion vesicles, in the axon terminals, and it's just going to wait there until the release. Let's look at kind of a graph of how this works. Up here we have the hypothalamus, and like I was saying, up here we have these cell bodies of these neurons. Their axons are going to be extending down to the posterior pituitary here, where they are synapsing onto these capillaries. They're going to release neurohormone into these capillaries, the vasopressin and the oxytocin, that will then be carried away into the bloodstream. So that is specifically what's happening with the posterior pituitary. Let's talk a little bit about these two different hormones that it is secreting. The first being vasopressin, and vasopressin is also known as antidiuretic hormone because it blunts the urination of animals that it's active in. And it's going to do this by enhancing retention of water by the kidneys. And under normal conditions, this is the hormone that is actually regulating water balance in the body. So both water balance being excreted in the urine, how much is being exported from the body that way, but through that is going to maintain the water balance of the body itself. So this is really important for that. It's also going to cause contraction of arterial smooth muscle. So certain types of arterial smooth muscle are going to contract, and this is going to cause an increase in blood pressure, therefore the vasopressin name. Okay, oxytocin, we're not going to talk a lot about right now, but oxytocin is involved in various social bonding actions, and then it also stimulates contraction of uterine smooth muscle during parturition in this positive feedback loop. So as you get uterine contractions, this is going to stimulate the release of more oxytocin, which in turn stimulates more uterine contractions. And this is going to actually, this positive feedback loop between oxytocin and uterine contractions is going to be what eventually causes labor to begin and causes the delivery of the child. Okay, so let's move on to the anterior pituitary here. And the anterior pituitary is really a very different animal from the posterior pituitary. It's connected to the hypothalamus through a vascular portal system. Now, vascular portal system, there's several of these in the body. Perhaps you've heard of the hepatic portal system before. This is one that's much smaller, but working on the same principle. And the principle is that we have blood flowing into a capillary bed. And normally, once blood goes from an artery into a capillary bed, it goes into a vein and back to the heart again to be reoxygenated in the lungs and then back out to the body. Well, in a portal system, what happens is once it leaves that first capillary bed, it's going to go through a portal vein that collects from that capillary bed and then delivered to another capillary bed again. And then once it leaves that capillary bed, then it has a vein that goes back to the heart and then can go through reoxygenation and repumping back out to the blood. So this is what a portal system is, and we have a portal system going on in the anterior pituitary. So what this means is that nearly all the blood that's going to the anterior pituitary has gone through the hypothalamus already in a capillary bed, so it's been in close contact with the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary, and then goes into another capillary bed where it's in very close contact with the anterior pituitary as well. And what this does is it allows the hypothalamus to provide hormones in high concentration, and very quickly to the anterior pituitary. So it can do this very, very quickly and get what it needs there in fairly high concentrations. So let's take a look at how this is happening. Again, we have the hypothalamus up here, which is part of the central nervous system. So again, we have our neurons here, which are going to then synapse in the infundibulum, or the beginning of the infundibulum here, onto this capillary bed. It's going to secrete some sort of hormones. Then they're going to be transported here through these pituitary portal veins to the anterior pituitary, where it goes through another bed of capillaries, where those hormones that were released by the hypothalamus are picked up, received by whatever target cells. That's going to affect some sort of reaction, and then the pituitary is going to adjust its release of hormones, either up or down based on that signal it gets, and then release those into the blood system as well. So that's how this connection works between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So most anterior pituitary hormones are tropic. So again, what tropic means is that these are hormones that are causing the release of other hormones, and there are 6 of them in total. So first off, we have growth hormone, or what's also known as somatotropin, and this is made by specialized cells called somatotropes. So what's after the colon here for all of these is going to be the specialized cell that is going to be secreting this particular type of hormone. And growth hormone is going to be, as the name suggests, regulating body growth. It has several other actions as well, but I'm only going to be relating to you the very specific major actions that each of these is responsible for. Now just kind of keep in mind that there's more actions that happen, but these are the main ones. We also have thyroxine-stimulating hormone, or TSH, and this is going to be made by thyrotropes in the anterior pituitary. And thyroxine-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate secretion of thyroid hormones, and it's also going to stimulate growth of the thyroid gland. We also have adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and it's made by corticotropes. And this is going to stimulate cortisol release from the adrenal cortex, and it's also going to stimulate growth of the adrenal cortex. Kind of similar actions there. We also have follicle-stimulating hormone, which is a sex-related hormone, and this is going to be made by the gonadotropes. This is one of two different hormones that is made by the gonadotropes, one that we're going to talk about next. And in females, this causes the growth and development of the ovarian follicles, so important for reproduction there. Also in males, this is required for sperm production. So in both cases, it is one of the main hormones that is responsible for the formation of gametes. So then we have luteinizing hormone, or LH, also made by the gonadotropes. So this is the second one. Luteinizing hormone controls essentially sex hormone secretion in other parts of the body. Then we also have prolactin. That is created by lactotropes, and prolactin actually have very, very wide-ranging action. So the first action that we knew about is that it actually stimulates milk production, so that's why it gets the name prolactin. However, it also has other actions that relate to reproduction regulation, but also in osmolar regulation, growth regulation, water drive, other things like that. So this is a very wide-ranging, very important hormone that's being made there. So let's talk just a second. So we have these hormones that are being created by the hypothalamus, and hormones are being provided to the anterior pituitary by the hypothalamus, and control the secretion of the anterior pituitary. So we have these hormones that are being released by the hypothalamus, and these hormones are going to travel to the anterior pituitary and somehow control what the anterior pituitary is releasing. So, for instance, we have thyrotropin-releasing hormone. This is going to stimulate TSH and prolactin. We also have corticotropin-releasing hormone. That is going to stimulate the release of ACTH. We have gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That's going to stimulate follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We also have growth hormone-releasing hormone. That's going to stimulate the release in the anterior pituitary of growth hormone. We have growth hormone-inhibiting hormone. So not all of these hormones that are going to be provided by the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary are stimulating hormones. Some of them are actually inhibiting. So for instance, here, this is one of them. We're going to have this hormone inhibiting the release of growth hormone. We also have prolactin-releasing hormone, which is going to stimulate the release of prolactin. So again, these are named for their primary functions, but one thing I want you to remember is that there's actually multiple functions for each of these. I'll come back to that. And then we also have prolactin-inhibiting hormone, which is going to inhibit the release of prolactin. So we have this list of quite a few hormones that the hypothalamus is going to be releasing into the capillaries through the pituitary portal system to the anterior pituitary, and this is going to modulate the type of hormones that the anterior pituitary is releasing. And so this together, this chain of hormones, is what's known as an endocrine axis. And this endocrine axis is this 3-hormone hierarchical chain of command. So for instance, the hypothalamus will be releasing thyrotropin-releasing hormone. That's going to travel to the anterior pituitary, and that's going to cause the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone, which will travel to the thyroid and stimulate the release of thyroid hormone. So really, we have this one hormone stimulating the release of another hormone, but stimulates the release of a third hormone. Why in the world do we do this? So it actually turns out, the thing you have to keep in mind, we're telling you the major actions. I'm telling you the major actions of each of these hormones, but this is not the only actions. Most of these hormones have more than one minor effect. And so what this happens is, like in the nervous system, we get divergence of signal happening in these hormones. We actually get one hormone that's going to stimulate majorly one other hormone, but also a few others as well. And then we can have divergence at each of these. But also, most pituitary hormones are actually controlled by more than one hypophysiotropic, so one coming from the hypothalamus, multiple hypophysiotropic hormones. And this allows for, not divergence of signal, but convergence of signal. So this allows for a convergence of signal when we have multiple types of hormones that control, to some minor extent at least, the control of each of these pituitary hormones. So we both have divergence and convergence of signal because of these endocrine axes that we have, these three hormone hierarchical kind of chains that happen to cause hormonal regulation in the body. So let's talk a little bit about, so the hypothalamus is beginning this whole chain. How is that being controlled? Well, first off, the hypothalamus is part of the central nervous system. So it's getting all these neuronal connections from other parts of the brain that are helping to modulate its function, and the neurons of the hypothalamus can integrate those signals and elicit either action potentials or no action potentials that will go on to release neurotransmitter or neurohormone, whichever the case may be. So one of the main connections that's going on here is that the hypothalamus has close connections with the amygdala. The amygdala is connected with emotional processing, so you actually get some hormonal release that is connected with emotional processing, such as an animal becomes stressed, it's more likely to upregulate the cortisol axis, and we actually get release of cortisol, a stress hormone. But also, in some parts of the hypothalamus, there's no blood-brain barrier either, and this allows the hypothalamus to detect blood chemistry. Now, this is important because then the hypothalamus can adjust the release of hormone to bring blood chemistry back towards a set point and keep that relatively stable. So that's another way that some amount of control is happening with the hypothalamus. Also, we can have inhibition by target cells down the road. So the final hormone in some of these axes can inhibit the production of the first or second hormones, and thus down-regulating its own production if it gets to be too high. So one of these examples is CRH will create ACTH or simulate the production of ACTH, which then in the adrenal cortex causes the release of the secretion of cortisol. So cortisol actually in this axis will inhibit the production of CRH and ACTH. So then if that gets too high, it's actually causing or preventing its own secretion. So that's really all I have for the pituitary. Let's move on to a couple of the other endocrine-only glands that we want to talk about.